Paul Walker's life was defined by cars, on screen and off. But few know the story of the final vehicle he purchased before his tragic death. It wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of who he was and what he was planning for the future. To millions of fans, Paul Walker will forever be remembered as Brian O'Connor, the undercover cop turned street racer who lived life a quarter mile at a time. But to those who knew him best, Paul was never acting. The role that made him a global star was simply an extension of who he already was, a man born with gasoline in his veins and a passion for speed that stretched far beyond the camera. Long before Hollywood scripts, Paul's life revolved around machines. As a teenager in Southern California, he spent more time in garages than at parties, learning the language of carburetors, gear ratios, and torque. While other kids bragged about sneakers or stereos, Paul saved for parts. Anything that made his cars go faster. Hollywood brought him fame, but it didn't change the core of who he was. On set, between takes, Paul would huddle with mechanics, picking their brains, asking about setups and tuning. He wasn't content to just play the part of a car guy. He lived it. His garage became a rotating shrine to performance. Japanese imports like the Toyota Supra and Nissan Skyline, European exotics like Porsches and BMWs, and American muscle that roared with raw nostalgia. Each car wasn't just a possession, it was a reflection of his curiosity and respect for all things automotive. But Paul's connection to cars ran deeper than horsepower. They represented freedom, escape, and identity. Driving gave him peace from Hollywood pressures, a place where he wasn't a movie star. He was just another gearhead chasing the next ride. His friends often said he smiled the most when he was behind the wheel, hair whipping in the wind, hands gripping the shifter. And yet, beneath all the noise, one question lingers. If Paul Walker lived his entire life through cars, then what did it mean when he bought his final one? What story does that last purchase tell about the man behind the legend and the road he never got to finish? Paul Walker's garage wasn't built for display or bragging rights. It was a living museum of his soul. Most celebrities gravitated toward flashy Lamborghinis or custom Bentleys, designed more for paparazzi than passion. But Paul's collection told a different story. He didn't care if the average person recognized the badge on the hood. What mattered was the spirit under the sheet metal. Japanese performance cars made up the heart of his collection. He adored the Skyline GT-RS, machines revered in Japan but still rare in the United States. To Paul, they weren't just fast, they were symbols of precision engineering, underdogs that could embarrass European supercars at a fraction of the cost. His Supras and RX-7s weren't kept pristine in air-conditioned garages either. He drove them hard, tuned them, raced them. These weren't trophies. They were companions. But he didn't limit himself to imports. He also owned Porsches, BMW M3s, and Audis, European icons that represented balance and handling finesse. And then there were his American muscle cars, big block Camaros, classic Chevelles and Mustangs that roared with nostalgia. To Paul, they were reminders of where it all started, raw, loud, and unpolished, but full of heart. Every corner of his garage reflected variety. Every car had a purpose. Some were track weapons, others restoration projects, and a few were simply too rare to pass up. His collection wasn't about money. It was about respect. Respect for craftsmanship, history, and the stories cars carried with them. And yet, even with all this variety, in the last months of his life, Paul began searching again. Searching for something missing. Something that wasn't about collecting, but about connecting. His next car wouldn't be about adding to a fleet. It would be about defining where he was headed. But what kind of car could fill that role? The last weeks of Paul Walker's life were bittersweet. Professionally, he was still in the middle of his career-defining franchise, filming Fast and Furious 7 with co-stars who had become more like family. Personally, he was more grounded than ever, balancing fatherhood with his philanthropic work through Reach Out Worldwide. To the public, it looked like Paul had everything: fame, wealth, success. But his close circle knew he was shifting. His focus was less on Hollywood deals and more on meaning. He spent much of his downtime in garages, sometimes at his own, sometimes at the shop run by his friend Roger Rodas. Together, they wrenched on cars, shared ideas, and sketched plans for future projects. Paul wasn't just buying cars anymore. He was thinking ahead, planning what to build next. He attended charity events, gave interviews, and posed for photos. But behind the smiles, he was reflective. Friends recall him talking about wanting to slow down, not in terms of speed, but in lifestyle. He wanted to be more present for his daughter Meadow. He wanted his work with Reach Out Worldwide to expand beyond disaster relief. And in quiet moments, he was thinking about his next car, not for status, but for personal meaning. Those final days, full of laughter, charity, and creativity, carry a haunting weight now, because intertwined with them was the story of a car, the last car Paul Walker would ever buy. And as his final days ticked away, he seemed more excited than ever about what he had found. But what was this vehicle that captured his attention so fully? And why did it matter so much at that moment in his life? Paul Walker had a philosophy about cars. They had to move him, not just physically, but emotionally. As the years passed, his taste evolved. He wasn't chasing horsepower numbers or magazine headlines anymore. He was chasing connection. In the final weeks of his life, that pursuit took on a new urgency. Friends say he was scanning auctions, looking at private sales, quietly discussing options with trusted contacts. He wasn't looking for another Skyline, another Porsche, or another piece of Hollywood glamour. He wanted something that reflected who he was becoming, a man stepping into maturity, focused on authenticity, legacy, and family. The search led him towards something unique, a car that wasn't flashy, but had soul. A vehicle that carried a story worth preserving, and one that he could make his own through restoration and modification. He hinted to friends that this car was different. It wasn't about adding to his collection, it was about starting a new chapter. And when he found it, the decision came quickly. Papers were signed. The car was his. For Paul, it wasn't just another purchase, it was a statement, a reflection of his shifting priorities, his evolving identity. But here lies the haunting truth. This wasn't just the last car Paul Walker bought. It was the last car he would ever buy, a symbol of unfinished plans, a machine that now sits at the center of one of the greatest tragedies in automotive history. When Paul finally found the car, it wasn't the sort of purchase Hollywood insiders expected. He could have walked into any showroom and driven out with a brand new hypercar, but that wasn't his style. He didn't want something gaudy that screamed for attention on Rodeo Drive. He wanted something with history, character, and potential. The car he chose reflected a different side of Paul, a side that was evolving. Friends described the smile on his face when he signed the papers. This wasn't just a transaction, it was personal. Unlike the Supras and Skylines that connected him to fans through the Fast and Furious franchise, this car spoke only to him. It wasn't famous. It wasn't hyped. In fact, many people didn't even know he had bought it. It was understated, almost humble, yet powerful in its own quiet way. For Paul, it represented the idea of transformation, of taking something raw and unfinished and turning it into a masterpiece. Some said it was a nod to his younger days, when he scraped money together to buy used cars he could restore. Others believed it showed his shift in mindset, moving away from adrenaline and toward legacy. The truth may lie somewhere in between. What mattered wasn't the horsepower or the badge on the hood. What mattered was that Paul saw possibility in it. And that's what makes this purchase haunting. Because while Paul had signed the papers, started the journey, and envisioned the future, fate had other plans. The car, meant to be a beginning, would instead become an ending. To Paul, cars weren't static. They were evolving works of art, and the last car he bought was never meant to stay stock. He had already begun imagining its transformation, plans scribbled in notebooks, conversations with Roger Rodas, even sketches that hinted at the upgrades he envisioned. He wanted to breathe new life into it, to make it a reflection of himself at that point in time. The notes described suspension work, subtle body refinements, and an engine swap that would have given the car both modern reliability and timeless character. Friends said he talked about making it something he could drive daily, not just store away. It wasn't about creating a showpiece for others to admire. It was about building something that felt authentic, a car he could enjoy on his own terms. Paul was always tinkering, always imagining what a car could be rather than accepting what it was. That mindset turned his garage into a workshop of ideas. This final car was no different. It was a canvas. He was excited, energized, ready to dive into the project with the same passion that had fueled him since his teenage years. But tragedy froze those plans in time. The car remained untouched, its potential locked away forever. His sketches became artifacts, his conversations became echoes, and the vehicle itself became a haunting reminder of what could have been. What made this final car even more meaningful was how it tied back to Paul's deepest passion outside of acting, his charity. Reach out worldwide. He never saw cars as just machines. He saw them as tools, as opportunities to connect, to give back, to inspire. Friends recall him talking about showcasing the car at fundraising events, maybe even raffling it to raise money for disaster relief efforts. It wasn't about building it for himself. It was about building it for others. That was Paul's nature. For all his fame, he lived modestly compared to most movie stars. What he did splurge on, cars, he often turned into something greater. Whether it was helping a friend with a project, donating time to charity events, or using his collection to generate awareness, his passion for cars was always linked to people. And this last car was no exception. The plans weren't just technical, they were purposeful. This vehicle wasn't going to sit idle in his garage gathering dust. It was going to become a part of his mission, a project with heart, tied directly to the work he cared most about. That's what makes its story so tragic. Because while the car sat under its cover, waiting for Paul to transform it, the opportunity slipped away. What could have been a symbol of hope, of giving back, instead became a ghost, an unfinished dream forever connected to the man who bought it with more than speed in mind. Paul Walker's private garage was more than just a storage space. It was a sanctuary. Unlike the cars shown off on magazine covers or paraded at charity events, this was where his true self lived. Rows of vehicles sat side by side, some gleaming, some half disassembled, some covered in tarps as if sleeping. This wasn't Hollywood's version of a garage. It wasn't spotless or staged for cameras. It was raw. Oil stains scarred the concrete. Tools rested in mid-project, and sketches taped to the walls told stories of ideas in progress. And in one corner, beneath a heavy cover, sat the car, the last one Paul had ever purchased. To step into that space was to step into a haunting silence. The car didn't roar with life. It didn't shine under the lights. It waited, untouched, suspended in time. Visitors said the atmosphere was heavy, almost sacred, as if the garage itself understood the weight of what it held. For Paul, the garage had always been a place of peace. Away from the film sets, away from the flashing cameras, it was where he could just be a mechanic, a dreamer, a kid who loved cars. To see the final purchase resting there, hidden among his other machines, was to see a portrait of who he truly was, a man who valued the process more than the glory, the quiet moments more than the applause. Now, with his absence, that garage has become something else, a time capsule, a frozen memory of what might have been. Every bolt, every note, every covered car tells a story unfinished, and none more haunting than the one sitting under that tarp. The last car Paul Walker ever chose for himself. After Paul's death, his garage became the focus of endless speculation. Fans wanted to know what would happen to his collection. Collectors circled, hoping to acquire pieces of it, and the media searched for headlines. Over time, some of his vehicles were auctioned, fetching staggering prices because they carried his name. Others were kept within his family, preserved as private memories rather than public spectacle. But the fate of his last purchase has remained shrouded in mystery. Unlike the Supras that made headlines or the Skylines immortalized by the Fast and Furious franchise, this car was never public. Few even knew it existed before his passing. Some say it stayed where he left it, in his garage, untouched, preserved by his family as a sacred keepsake. Others whisper it was quietly sold, disappearing into the shadows of the collector world its identity hidden out of respect or secrecy. The ambiguity only adds to its legend, because unlike other cars tied to Paul, this one carried unfinished plans. It wasn't just another machine in his fleet, it was the car that represented his next step, and that makes its absence all the more haunting. Fans may never know exactly where it is now, or if it will ever resurface, but perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps its mystery is what keeps it sacred, what keeps it tied so intimately to Paul's final days. Wherever it rests, one truth remains. The car embodies the dreams Paul never got to complete. And in that silence, its story speaks louder than any engine ever could. In the end, Paul Walker's last car wasn't about horsepower, top speed, or celebrity status. It was about authenticity. It reflected a man who had spent his life surrounded by speed and fame, yet sought something quieter, more personal in his final purchase. It wasn't a car for red carpets or flashing cameras. It was a car for Paul, for the mechanic, the dreamer, the father, the philanthropist. That's what makes its story so powerful. Because when we think of Paul's final ride, we often picture the Porsche Carrera GT, the car he tragically lost his life in. But that wasn't the last car he chose. His last choice was something different, something more meaningful. A car that wasn't about Hollywood, but about him. And in that distinction lies his legacy. Paul Walker will always be remembered as a movie star, as Brian O'Connor, as the face of one of the most iconic car franchises in history. But to those who look deeper, he'll be remembered as a true gearhead, a man whose love for cars was genuine, whose collection was built on passion, and whose final purchase told the truth about who he really was.
The last car Paul Walker bought remains shrouded in mystery. But maybe that's the point. Maybe it isn't about the badge, the specs, or even the fate of the vehicle. Maybe it's about what it represented. A man whose life was cut short, but who lived every mile authentically. And perhaps that unfinished car, sitting in silence, says more about Paul's legacy than any film ever could.